Hello, everyone. Welcome to video 2 of the 2020 Florida MPJE Boot Camp. Again, I'm Gary Cacciatore, and I'll be your instructor for this course. We're going to do Chapter 2 today, or at least start Chapter 2 with this video. We'll see how far we get. My guess is this is going to be a long chapter because it's so important to cover both federal and Florida Controlled Substances Act. So most likely this will be a two-part video, but we'll see how far we can get with today's video. Before we start, just a couple of disclaimers and warnings. As always, I don't have any particular knowledge about the questions that are on the MPJE, and I'm not affiliated with NABP, and this course is not affiliated with NABP or endorsed by NABP. And just a reminder again, all this material that you're watching, including the slides, video, and audio, is copyright protected and may not be recorded, reproduced, or stored without the permission of Florida pharmacy regulatory advisors. Okay, with that, we're going to jump right into Chapter 2 in your review book and talk about the Controlled Substances Act. Obviously, controlled substances are a huge part of pharmacy practice and a huge part of the MPJE. A lot of it is based on federal law, but a lot of states have very, very specific laws that apply in those states. So it's kind of a combination, and that's why we try to combine both Florida Controlled Substances Act and the Federal Controlled Substances Act into one chapter, because you got to remember that general rule that we talked about in video 1 is you have to answer every question on this exam based on the stricter law. So the first thing to realize about the system of controlled substance regulation is what DEA has done, the federal government has done, is they've set up this closed system of distribution, and drugs are classified. Drugs that could be addictive are classified based on their schedules. So you need to know basically which drugs are in which schedule. And kind of what and generally what those schedules mean. And you're going to find as you go through some of the topics in this chapter that a lot of times when you get a question in this area, the answer is going to be dependent upon what schedule it's in. And for the most part, the Schedule 2 drugs have a lot of specific rules that apply to them. So when you're looking at a question, make sure you realize, am I dealing with a Schedule 2 drug or is it a different drug? Generally, Schedule 3, 4, and 5 have some of the same rules that you'll see. But even within those now, there's some differences. And as states have started addressing specific actions on opioid drugs, they've complicated that a little bit more. But you do need to know which drugs are in which schedule. Starting with Schedule 1 drugs, you won't see in practice that much because those drugs have no known medical use. So things like heroin and LSD are in Schedule 1. Don't forget that marijuana is also in Schedule 1. And I got a study tip there for you on page 45. We don't have the time to get into the details on marijuana, but federally, it is still considered a Schedule 1 controlled substance, meaning it is illegal to be in possession or use that drug. This is despite the fact that we have many states that have medical marijuana laws and even recreational marijuana laws. From a legal standpoint, all of those laws are invalid, but the issue is that they're not being enforced, right? The federal government is not coming into states and shutting those operations down. If they wanted to do that um, from a pure legal basis, they actually could, because the federal law, um, when the laws conflict, the federal law wins over the state laws. I do think it's interesting that the MPJE competency statements have the word marijuana in them. Do I expect you to see questions on marijuana? No, because under federal law, it's an illegal drug. Maybe you get that question. It's a Schedule 1 controlled substance. So it concerns me a little bit to see that in the competency statements. My only guess, and this is totally a guess on my part, is there are some states where there's several states actually where boards of pharmacy have been tasked with as being the agency that licenses marijuana dispensaries. That should not be an issue on the MPJE, because as a pharmacy, you can't have marijuana in your pharmacy. You are risking your DEA registration. So if you want to go into that business, and some states require the pharmacy board to issue those licenses, um, that's fine, but don't do it in your pharmacy because that's where DEA will enforce the law if a pharmacy tried to do this. My only guess would be that in a couple of states, not only do the boards of pharmacy issue the dispensary licenses, my understanding is in one or two states at least, they require a pharmacist to be on the premises of these facilities. So maybe that's why they added it to the MPJE competency statements. I don't know. That one doesn't make a lot of sense to me. All right, so let's talk about Schedule II drugs. Schedule II drugs obviously have an accepted medical use, but have the highest degree of abuse potential, severe or physical or psychological dependence. And here you have a lot of your opioid drugs and narcotics, things like codeine and dihydrocodeine, oxycodone, um, uh, methadone, uh, meperidine, which is Demerol, fentanyl, and cocaine. Don't forget, cocaine is Schedule II, even though it is kind of a street drug. There is medical cocaine, and it does have a medical use. So you could have cocaine, particularly in a hospital pharmacy. That's a Schedule II drug. There's a couple of products, the barbiturates that are in Schedule II, secobarbital, amobarbitol, and pentobarbital, that are Schedule II when they, under the federal law, when they are in pill form and oral solid dosage forms. If you turn the page over to Schedule III on page 46, you'll actually see that the suppository forms of those products, of amobarbitol, secobarbital, and pentobarbital, are actually Schedule III because they're less likely to be abused in suppository form, apparently, than in oral form. I put in the study tip there that is how it's set up under federal law. When I went to the Florida Controlled Substances Act, I didn't see that distinction made for the suppository products. So my reading of that is those suppository products of those products, forms of those products, would technically be Schedule II in Florida. I've never seen anybody in Florida treat them that way. I'm not sure that the Board of Pharmacy or anybody in Florida realizes there's a difference there. And the reason I say that is there's a book that comes out every year called the NABP Survey of Pharmacy Law, and they ask boards of pharmacies questions about their laws in general. It's a good starting point when you're trying to compare laws in different states. And one of the questions they ask on that survey is, does your state have any differences in your controlled substance schedules from federal law? And under Florida, it says no, there's no differences. Well, there is, I found one difference. So I don't know what to tell you on that one. Hopefully you won't get a question that's that particular, but I would treat them as Schedule II, at least for the MPJE purposes. Other things in Schedule III, you see listed for you on number 4 there on page 46. That is certain products like codeine products with acetaminophen, Tylenol number 3, Tylenol number 4. Those products fall into Schedule III because they're less likely to be abused. Remember, codeine by itself was in Schedule II, but when it's mixed with acetaminophen, it drops down to Schedule III. And in certain cases, it could actually drop down to Schedule V. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we're going to talk about how you figure out the schedule of drugs that are compounded. It used to be the same situation with hydrocodone products, right? Pure hydrocodone was Schedule II, but if it was mixed with acetaminophen or something else, you had products like Vicodin and so forth that were Schedule III. DEA rescheduled the hydrocodone combination products, so they are all Schedule II. So if you get a question on hydrocodone, I don't care what the concentration is, it's going to be Schedule II. When you get down to Schedule IV products, you've got your your benzodiazepines. There's also some stimulant drugs in there. Some of the weight loss drugs like diethylpropion and phentermine. Phenobarbital is another drug that's in Schedule IV. And then you got carisoprodol, soma, and tramadol, butorphanol, products like that are all in Schedule 4. What you won't find is there's really no narcotic drugs in Schedule 4. The narcotics, being the opium related drugs, are all in either Schedule 2, 3, or 5. Schedule 5 drugs have the least potential for abuse. And here you'll find some uh, Robitussin AC is a good example. Robitussin with codeine, right? It's at a lower concentration, enough that it's in Schedule 5, and some other products in Schedule 5. There's some antidiarrheal products that have a little bit of opium derivatives in them. Also things like Lyrica, pregabalin, is in Schedule 5. On the top of page 47, I mentioned Epidiolex, which is the only FDA-approved cannabidiol drug, CBD drug, was placed into Schedule 5. It's now been removed from Schedule 5. It's probably set the world record for a drug getting scheduled and then getting unscheduled, less than a year apart, I think. So Florida has not yet matched that. I'm expecting that they will soon, because I know the company that makes Epidiolex is working to get it descheduled in all the states. And most of the states tend to follow what DEA does. But it takes some time sometimes, because some states can do it by rule. Other states have to do it by passing a new law to change it. So as of the time of this recording, technically Epidiolex is still Schedule 5 in Florida, but I do expect it to be non-scheduled fairly soon. I got a section there on page 47 about who has the authority to schedule controlled substances. Under the federal law, it's the U.S. Attorney General. And the reason why it's the U.S. Attorney General is because the DEA is part of the Department of Justice, and the head of the Department of Justice is the U.S. Attorney General. That doesn't mean that Bill Barr, the Attorney General, is going to decide to schedule drugs. He's going to leave that up to his agency, the DEA. But technically, it's the U.S. Attorney General who has the authority to do that. And same thing in Florida. It's the Florida Attorney General for the state of Florida. Okay. One other thing on the schedules and the drugs that are in them. You need to know the more common ones, I think, but you also need to know both brand names and generic names. You need to know, because they could ask the question either way. That's very typical of the MPJE to do things like that. So let's talk on page 47 about registration. I mentioned this in the very beginning. The entire system of regulating controlled substances is based on this closed system of distribution, where everyone who deals with these controlled substances has to be registered with the DEA. So anybody who manufactures or imports or exports or distributes or prescribes or dispenses or does chemical analysis, there's different types of registrations. Everyone's got to be registered, and the controlled substances are only allowed to be transferred from one DEA registrant to another. If they go outside of that closed system of distribution, that's considered diversion of controlled substances. They're not supposed to go out of that closed system of distribution until when? Until they finally dispense to the patient based on a valid prescription. Then they're no longer part of the closed system of distribution. Okay, so everyone who deals with these things have to be registered. The registration form for the category of registrants that you'll be dealing with the most, which is dispensers, start with the letter A, B, or F. And the reason why you deal that category the most is the dispenser category of registration includes not only pharmacies, which are dispensers, but it also includes all the prescribers. There's not a separate category of a DEA registration called a prescriber registration. And that's because in most states, if you can prescribe, you can dispense. Now, a lot of states have restrictions on dispensing of controlled substances by practitioners. But just realize DEA doesn't have a separate registration called one for prescribers. They've got one for manufacturers. They've got one for distributors. They've got one for dispensers. They've got one for importers, exporters, and you'll see the list of the type of registrations they have on page 48, people doing research, importing, exporting, okay? Those are the types of activities you are authorized to perform with your particular type of registration, depending on what state law allows you. But that big one is dispensing, and that registration is a 3-year registration. A lot of the other ones are 1-year registrations. Going back to 47 on the bottom of the page there, the dispenser registration starts with the letter A, B, or F. Basically, they started out with A's and they ran out of A's and they went to B's. They ran out of B's and now they're issuing registrations that start with the letter F. That's the first letter. The second letter is going to be the first letter of the last name of the registrant. So for a prescriber, it's going to be the first letter of the last name of the prescriber. For a pharmacy, which also gets a dispenser registration, it would be the first letter of the name of the company, of the pharmacy. Sometimes it may not match the business name, but it should be the corporate name of the pharmacy, because a corporation could be doing business under another name to the public, but the corporate name who owns the pharmacy could be different. Okay. The mid-level practitioners on the bottom of page 47 are, those registrations start with the letter M. And a mid-level practitioner is a type of practitioner who is authorized to either possess or dispense or prescribe controlled substances, and by the state, because the state decides who can deal with the controlled substances. And if the state says that this type of practitioner can prescribe or can be in possession of controlled substances, then DEA will issue them a registration. But they issue a mid-level practitioner registration when those practitioners don't have what I call independent authority to prescribe. So this is like your physician assistants, your nurse practitioners. They are operating under the authority of a supervising physician. So it's not completely independent authority. So that's why the DEA calls them mid-level practitioners, and their registrations will start with the letter M to kind of designate them separately. Okay, so on the top of page 48, what I was alluding to was those different types of activities require different types of registrations. You know, just because you have a DEA registration as a dispenser in your pharmacy, and I've gotten this question before, you know, can I export some drugs to another country, controlled substances? No, you can't, because you don't have an exporter registration, and you can't import them, and you can't do chemical analysis of them, and you can't run a narcotic treatment program. We'll talk about that a little bit later. You can't conduct research, okay? The only one that you might be able to do a little bit as a dispenser is DEA does allow you to do a minimal amount of distribution, because they have to, because you may have to return things back to the wholesaler. That's a distribution, that's not a dispensing, right? Or you may need to send drugs away to be destroyed by a reverse distributor. That's also a distribution. You can do that under something it's called the 5% rule, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. You can do a little bit of that, okay? But you can't do anything else that's listed here. Okay, in the middle of page 48, you see the formula to verify DEA registration number. I'm not going to spend the time to go through that, but you should know that. You could get a question that asks you to say which one of these DEA registrations is valid. It's a simple little formula. You do the calculation, and the last number you get, the last digit should be match the last digit of the DEA number. Not a big help anymore. I think a lot of the bad guys probably know the secret formula as well. The next item E on page 48 is, you got to remember this. DEA operates that each location needs a separate registration. And I can't tell you how many times I've run into this in my practice where pharmacists forget this. You know, I see it mainly in hospital situations where you've got a hospital and they've got an offsite emergency room that's, you know, 2 or 3 miles away, and the hospital says, oh, we consider that a department of the hospital. That's fine. You can consider it a department of the hospital as far as billing and whatever you want to do. But DEA is not going to consider it part of the hospital because they're going to require a separate registration because it's at a separate address. So you can't just send controlled substances to that location like you do other parts of the hospital that are covered by your hospital's DEA registration. That's going to need a separate registration. Now, DEA will issue a campus registration for these large hospitals that might cover more than one address. But they do that on a case-by-case basis. So you need to be very clear when, if you work in a hospital setting, which buildings and which parts of my facility are covered by this DEA registration. I can guarantee if it's 3 miles away from your main facility, and it's not likely to be considered part of your campus registration. And I've seen hospitals sending, controlled substances to this other location 3 miles away, a clinic or off-site emergency room. And they've got great records of it. No drugs have been diverted, but DEA has said you're sending drugs to an unregistered location, and every time you do that, it's a potential $10,000 plus fine, right? And the fines, and you've been doing that for months or years, the fines can be fairly significant, just for not paying attention to what the law requires. So be careful about that. You can read through the application form to get registered for dispensers. It's a 224 form. We're going to be talking about a lot of forms today, 224s and 222s and 106s and 41s. So you got to make sure you keep all your DEA form numbers straight. Okay. On page 49 are the exemptions from registration. I said this is a closed system. Everybody's got to be registered, but there's always exceptions to the law, right? And you always got to know what those exceptions are. So who doesn't have to be registered? Well, the first one tells you it's an agent or an employee of a registered manufacturer, distributor, or dispenser, as long as they're acting within a normal course of business. Who would that be? That would be you guys as the pharmacists, right? So individual pharmacists are acting as an employee of the pharmacy, and the pharmacy is the DEA registrant. Individual pharmacists don't have DEA registrations, okay? In a few states they might, if they've got the authority to prescribe controlled substances, but that's not in Florida. That's kind of but a few states they can do that. But for the most part, that's how you're allowed to handle and be in possession of controlled substances in a pharmacy or in a hospital, because you're an employee. Same thing for the nurses who are administering controlled substances in a hospital. The individual nurses are not registered. They might be if they're an advanced practice nurse and prescribing, but just a regular nurse that's administering drugs in a hospital would just be an agent or employee of the hospital. And then you got your contract carriers, so if as a drug wholesaler, my company ships, we use contract carriers to deliver our drugs. They can be in possession of the controlled substances without being registered, as long as, again, they're acting within their scope of the business. And of course, I mentioned already the ultimate user, the patient, doesn't have to be registered. And there's another exemption for officials in the armed services and the U.S. public health services. In the military, physicians don't have to be registered with DEA, but I think what you'll find sometimes, a lot of times they get a DEA registration anyway. It just makes life easier for them, because a lot of the pharmacies' computer systems require a DEA number in order to process a prescription. Okay, and then letter H talks about practitioner's use of a hospital DEA number. And what this is, it really has to do with primarily interns and residents in a teaching hospital. And can they prescribe controlled substances, either for inpatient purposes for patients in the hospital, or even for outpatient of patients who are being discharged from the hospital or being seen in a clinic of the hospital. Can they use the hospital's DEA number if they don't have their own DEA number? And the answer is yes. I mean, I think honestly they fit under that first exemption, because the interns and residents are employed by the hospital. So they're an employee of the hospital. But what DEA has said is, so we can track which physician who actually wrote those prescriptions, that if they're going to use the hospital's DEA number, the hospital has to assign a suffix to the DEA number that identifies that particular intern or resident. So if you ever get a DEA number and it's got some numbers with a dash and 3 numbers at the end of it or something like that, and it's coming from a teaching hospital, that is a valid prescription, and it can actually be filled outside of the hospital at a pharmacy not affiliated with the hospital. But that's just help them identify which physician is prescribing under that hospital's DEA registration number. Then on the bottom of 49 over to page 50, is a section on temporary use of a registration upon sale of a pharmacy. This is an interesting one that it's just a practical thing that makes sense, right? The first thing to realize is, a DEA registration is not transferable. Um, if you have a DEA registration for your pharmacy, you can't just transfer it to a new owner if you're going to sell your pharmacy. So the new owner is going to have to get their own DEA registration. And to get a DEA registration, you first have to get your state license. Okay, so you have to get your pharmacy license. And then once you show the DEA you got your pharmacy license, you're allowed to, the state says you're allowed to possess drugs, they will issue a DEA registration. But if somebody's selling a pharmacy and they haven't gotten the new DEA registration, you don't want to stop operation of the pharmacy just because there's been a change of ownership. It wouldn't be fair to patients who need to come in and get their prescriptions filled. So this allows the old owner of the pharmacy to give the power of attorney to the new owner to use their DEA registration until such time as a new owner gets their own registration. And that's valid. The original guidance that came out on this said it could be done for up to 45 days. I will tell you, some DEA offices say you can go beyond the 45 days. Because it was a guidance document, it really wasn't a rule. If you get a question on this, I would go with the 45. It's only valid for 45 days because that's what the original guidance document said. Okay. So I mentioned that some of those products, some of the codeine products and some of the opium products could fall into different schedules depending on the concentration. So this next section, Roman numeral 3, scheduling of compounded controlled substances. It is specifically listed as an MPJE competency statement, so it's something you probably want to spend some time on, make sure you understand it. And the issue here is, trying to determine if a pharmacist is called to compound a prescription drug that has codeine or opium. There's some other drugs listed. I think ethyl morphine and hydrocodone is listed in the chart for this, but you can ignore the chart for hydrocodone because remember, like I told you, all combination hydrocodone products are now Schedule 2. I would just focus on the codeine and the opiums. Those are the ones that they tend to focus on. So those are the only ones I put in the book, actually. And a couple of things here. The first thing is you're allowed to compound with narcotic substances as long as the final concentration of what you're making is not greater than 20%. I don't have this in the book. I do have it in the corrections and update document that you can download from our website. That 20% limitation does not apply to injectable or sterile products, which makes sense actually, because sometimes if you're doing an injectable product, particularly like for an implantable pump or something like that, you probably could exceed 20%. But if you're making just a solid dosage forms or a solution or something like that, you can't go over 20% because DEA says if a pharmacy is compounding a controlled substance prescription that's greater than 20%, that's not dispensing anymore, that's manufacturing. And they don't even care if you've got a patient-specific prescription. Normally, when you're talking about compounding versus manufacturing, the key is if you got a prescription, patient-specific prescription, to compound something, that's not manufacturing. DEA says, no, we're going to set a limit only if it's less than 20%. So just be aware of that. That might be more of an issue in practice, I think, than it is for the MPJE. For the MPJE, they may ask you to calculate what schedule a drug is in for a compounded product, a compounded prescription. Before you start to figure out what the concentration is, look at bullet point number 2 there on the slide, okay? And it's letter B on page 50. The prescription has to be compounded with another non-narcotic therapeutic ingredient. So if the question is talking about how much codeine or opium is in, being asked to be mixed in with water or simple syrup, which is just sugar water, you don't have to do any calculations. Why? Because if you mix codeine with water, what do you have? You got diluted codeine. Okay, so I don't care what the concentration is. It could be 2 milligrams of codeine mixed in, 5 gallons of water. If you can find the codeine in there, it's still codeine. It's still Schedule 2. Okay, so make sure the question's got the codeine being mixed with acetaminophen or ibuprofen or a cough medicine or guaifenesin or something that's got another therapeutic ingredient that's not a narcotic. Okay, so first check for that. If you determine you got that, then you got to go and memorize these concentration limits. So if you look at codeine on the bottom of page 50, a product that has up to 200 milligrams per 100 mLs, that amount or less is considered Schedule 5. Okay, and I mentioned one already, like Robitussin AC is Robitussin with codeine, has exactly the maximum amount of codeine it can have in it to stay in Schedule 5. It has 200 milligrams per 100 ml. So if you just added 1 milligram of codeine to that, it would no longer be Schedule 5. It would jump to what? It jumps to Schedule 3. It's never going to go to Schedule 4. Okay, the Schedule 3 limit is one on the bottom of page 50. It's 1.8 grams per 100 mLs. So from 201 milligrams up to 1800 milligrams or 1.8 grams, the product is in Schedule 3. All right. Once you get above 1.8 grams or 1800 milligrams, it goes back to Schedule 2, just like pure codeine would be. All right. So that's how you would do this calculation. And I got the ones listed for opium as well for you. So I think I would concentrate on codeine and opium, not worry so much about any of the other ones that are listed in the actual DEA rules. Okay, so on 51 now we're going to talk about ordering Schedule 2 controlled substances. And this is mainly about DEA Form 222, all right? I realize, and I have it later on, there's an electronic system to do this, the CSOS system. It's a controlled substance ordering system. So you can order Schedule 2s using the CSOS system, and many pharmacies do that. And I think this is one of the difficulties I think sometimes students have with the MPJE is if you went through all your rotations or you've worked in a pharmacy for a long time, that doesn't do paper 222 forms anymore, you you could get tripped up on these types of questions because there's still going to be questions about the old-fashioned way of doing this with the paper, right? And to get even more complicated now, we got two versions, at least temporarily, of the 222 form. There's a triplicate 222 form, the traditional 3-part form, and then DEA's come out with a single copy 222 form. And right now, the single copy 222 form rule went into effect in October of 2019, but they gave a 2-year transition period. So we are like right now in the midst of this transition period. So there's always been questions about the triplicate 222 form on the MPJE, and at least for another year or 2 years, October of 2022, I guess, those questions can continue to be on the MPJE. So I think you need it. We're going to spend some time going over those. So just basic rules about the 222 form, and it's required anytime there's a sale or a transfer of Schedule 2 drugs. You fill out the form and you could put one item per form, how many quantity you want to order. Number 6 says that the form must be signed by the registrant. Okay, well, the registrant is the person who, the registrant is the individual if it's a physician, but if it's a pharmacy, the registrant is going to be the owner of the pharmacy. Okay, if it's a corporation, it'd be a corporate officer. If it's a partnership, it has to be one of the partners. So that's really the only person who can sign these forms. And we'll talk in a minute that we could do it right now, I guess. That person may not be the one who's going to do the ordering of the forms. So they can grant the authority to sign these forms to someone else in the pharmacy. And that's what normally happens, right? So they create a power of attorney, okay? Number 7 talks about the registrant can authorize other individuals to sign the 222 forms by creating a power of attorney, okay? The power of attorney basically says that, you know, I'm the person who's authorized to sign the 222 forms, but I'm making this person my attorney in fact is what they're called, and allows them to sign the forms. And the form, I don't think I have this in the book, but the form's got to be signed by the person granting the authority. It's also got to be signed by the person who's receiving the authority, the attorney in fact, and it requires 2 witnesses. And you can issue as many powers of attorney to people in the pharmacy you want to. There's no limit, right? And you probably gonna have more than one, because if only one person's in charge of ordering the 222s, if that person's off, nobody can order nobody can order the Schedule 2s that day. So, and does it have to be a pharmacist? No. Technicians can be granted the authority. Really, anybody working as an employee of the pharmacy can be given the power of attorney. And if you want to take away somebody's power of attorney to sign these forms, you have to revoke their power of attorney. And you don't send these to DEA. You keep a copy of the power of attorney with you with your order forms. Um, in case somebody ever asks to see them, does the person who signed this form actually have the authority to do that? If you turn over to page 52, a couple other items about the 222 forms. One thing I want you to remember is when you're thinking about ordering Schedule 2s and thinking about 222 forms, remember this rule, and that is whoever wants the drugs initiates the form. Whoever wants the drugs initiates the forms, or maybe you should do it this way. Whoever wants the Schedule 2s initiates the form, because this is only for Schedule 2s, right? So who fills out the 222 is the person who's ordering them, the person who wants the drugs, right? So if it's your pharmacy, you'll have 222 forms issued, and it's pre-printed with the name of your pharmacy on it, your DEA number, and they all have serial numbers on them. You've got to fill out the form, okay? So you initiate the process, and we'll talk about how you do that. When you send it to your supplier, on the top of page 52, it tells you the supplier actually has 60 days to complete that order. So you may not get everything back right away, right? And that order remains valid for up to 60 days. After 60 days, if you don't get your complete order, it becomes void, and you would have to reorder those particular products. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about the single copy 222 form. Again, this went into effect, I believe it was October of 2019. The DEA had to come up with a single form. It's an interesting story because the triplicate form is so old and the technology is so old. There's only one vendor who makes the 222 forms, and this is what I heard. I think it's a true story, is that the vendor whose machine makes these 222 forms can't get any more parts for their machine because the machine is so old. So they had to move quickly, and DEA did move quickly. They did this within a year, which for DEA that was really fast. So October 30th, 2019, they started issuing single copy 222 forms. But the way it works is similar to the triplicate form, but since you don't have but one copy, the purchaser has to make a photocopy of the form before they send it off to their supplier. And then the supplier doesn't have an extra copy to send to DEA, but most suppliers send stuff electronically. So they're not required to send a copy to DEA anymore because it's all paper form. A lot of this is done electronically, right? So only if a supplier is not doing electronic reporting to DEA would they have to send a copy of the 222 form to DEA with this new single copy form. Okay. There's a couple other differences. The new form has 20 lines versus 10 lines, so there's more places to order and so forth. But I think the most important thing to remember is that make sure you make a copy of that 222 form, the single copy one, before you send it out, because that copy that you make when the drugs come in, just like with a triplicate form, you would record what came in. That's the official record of the drugs, the Schedule 2 drugs that came into your pharmacy. Okay, so the triplicate form has 3 copies, and these can be used up until October 30th of I guess it started in 2019, so I misstated that earlier. Not till 2022. They can be used until October 30th, 2021, because it did get done at the end of last year. So we got to October 30th of 2021 to use these triplicate forms. And the way this works is whoever wants the drugs fills out their form, and you'll see in letter E, copies 1 and 2 are sent to the supplier, and you keep copy 3 for the record. Um, the supplier, when they send the drugs to you, they write down what they sent to you. They send copy 2 to the DEA, and they keep copy 1 for their records. Some of the early printings of our book had a typo there on letter G. It said copy 1 is the one that they retain. It is copy 3. If you got a newer printing of the book, you may have that. If not, it's in our update guide. So know where the different versions, different copies of the 222 forms go. Remember, the purchaser keeps copy 3, copies 1 and 2 go to the supplier, and the supplier sends copy 2 to the DEA, and they keep copy 1. And in the old days, before things were reported electronically, that's how DEA knew, okay, this supplier sent 5 bottles of Percocet, which is that was scheduled 2 back then, I guess. Yes, it was. So the supplier sent 5 bottles of Percocet to this pharmacy. The only way they would know that was by taking copy 2 of the 222 form, and they would have to enter that into a database. A lot of this is done electronically now. Okay. When you receive the drugs in your pharmacy, you have to indicate the number that you received on copy 3 of the 222 form. Okay. And then you date it, the date you received it as well. That is now your official copy and your official record of what came into your inventory as far as Schedule 2 controlled substances. It's whatever you wrote down on copy 3 of that 222 form. And if it's a single copy form, it's the photocopy that you made. You want to indicate what drugs came in. You might also get an invoice from the supplier, which is helpful, but just know that in DEA's eyes, it's copy 3 of the 222 form where you indicated what you received. That's the official record of what came into your pharmacy. All right. I mentioned the electronic ordering system, Seesaw system, on the top of page 54. Obviously, this makes it a lot easier. It works with digital certificates. So hopefully you've used this before, or you've seen it in action. It's just basically an electronic form of the 222 form, and there's digital certificates to make sure there's security of the forms and that they're not being transmitted outside of the system. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about ordering other controlled substances. Remember, all that was for Schedule 2. Now we're talking about Schedule 3 through 5 controlled substances. These products can be ordered just like you order any other controlled substance. You just order them from your wholesaler. So however you order through the internet or calling them up or whatever you want to do, they come in, but what's important is they got to be provided with an invoice, because the official record of the movement of Schedule 3 through 5 drugs is the invoice. So the invoice is important for 2 reasons. One, it's the official record, and 2, the thing you got to remember is, unlike the 222 form where the person who wants the drugs starts the form, here the person sending the drugs provides the invoice. So anybody sending you Schedule 3 through 5 controlled substances must send you an invoice. And the invoice has to contain certain items that are listed in the middle of page 54. Make sure you know what those items are. And it's common sense stuff: the name of the drug, the controlled substance, the dosage form, how many bottles of what you got, the quantity received, the date received, and the name, address, and DEA number from whom it was received. And if you ever are sending Schedule 3 through 5 controlled substances out of your pharmacy, right, and you're doing distribution to another pharmacy or returns or something like that, you can do that. We'll talk about that next. Make sure you create an invoice, right? And it's called an invoice, but just realize DEA doesn't care about the financial transaction. They could care less if it has no pricing on it, right? We think of an invoice as something that's got to be paid, right? And usually that is what it's used for. But in DEA terminology, the invoice is simply the record of where the drugs went, okay? They don't care about the financial transaction. So even if you're not going to charge a doctor for something, um, or you're going to send something to another pharmacy and they're going to send it back to you later, they're going to borrow from you. Um, as long as there's a record of it, that's fine. All right. So don't worry about the price or anything like that. That's not the issue. The invoice is the record of where the drugs moved. Okay. Um, the 5% rule. I alluded to this a couple of times. So as a dispenser, the main way that controlled substances leave your pharmacy is by dispensing prescriptions. But DEA realizes that, okay, you might have to also do some distribution, right? So distribution is different than dispensing, right? And rather than making pharmacies have a distribution registration, like my company is a drug wholesaler, we have a distribution registration. We can't dispense, right? We can't send drugs from our warehouse directly to a patient because we're not a dispenser, right? We're not a pharmacy. But DEA realized that, okay, pharmacies sometimes have to do a minimal amount of distribution when they return drugs back to the wholesaler. If a physician calls you up and says, hey, I need some, um, some Xanax for my office, dentists sometimes will use controlled substances in their offices. They may not have enough business to open an account with a wholesaler. They may want to purchase it from you. Can you sell a physician controlled substances? You can, as long as you stay under this 5% rule. And also make sure you have a record of it, right? And for Schedule 3 through 5, that record is going to be what? An invoice. All right. So now you're the supplier now. So if you're going to send controlled substances back to a wholesaler, or you're going to send them to another pharmacy, or you're going to send them to a physician's office, make sure you create an invoice. What do you do if it's a Schedule 2 drug? Can you do Schedule 2 drugs? Again, you can under this 5% rule, but make sure the person who's receiving them sends you a 222 form, right? And then you have to act like the supplier now. So you can do it. What is the 5% rule? The 5% rule says, well, as long as your distributions of controlled substances in a pharmacy is not more than 5% of your business, you're okay. You don't have to get a DEA registration as a distributor. And how do you calculate that? Well, you take all, and they do it by dosage units. So the total dosage units of controlled substances that you distributed in a 12-month time period, and it's any 12-month time period, you can never go over the 5% in any 12-month time period. The total dosage units that you distributed divided by the total amount you dispensed plus you distributed. Last time I checked, the DEA pharmacist manual has it wrong, actually, because to get a percentage, you need to have the number distributed divided by the number dispensed plus distributed. They put the number the distributed divided by the number dispensed. That's not a percentage then. So, but they don't, I guess they don't know math. So anyway, most pharmacies don't come close to the 5%, but you got to be careful. If you own multiple pharmacies and you're constantly borrowing or distributing back and forth between those pharmacies, you could get into trouble with the 5% rule. And don't just think that, well, if I go over 5%, I'll just get a registration as a distributor. There's all kinds of requirements for distributors that you probably can't meet as a pharmacy. Security, and you have to have a vault, and you have to have a safe, and you have to have lots of other rules and a cage. And you don't want to get in violation of this 5% rule. Okay. Other requirements on page 55, and we're going to talk here about storage and security. You'll be surprised to learn that the DEA rules for storage and security for a pharmacy are not as strict as you think. I mean, I just talked about having a cage and a vault and a distribution facility, right? As a distributor, we have to meet those requirements. But in a pharmacy, DEA actually says that controlled substances can be stored either in a secured cabinet that is locked. Okay, that doesn't only have to be a safe, but a secured cabinet that is locked, or the controlled substances may be dispersed throughout the regular pharmacy inventory. What does that mean? Does that mean I can stick my controlled substances up on the shelf and just mix them in with the other drugs? That's exactly what that means. all right? What you can't do is put all your controlled substances on one shelf, right, with a big sign on it that says narcotics, get your narcotics here. Because if someone comes in to rob your pharmacy, they'll be able to wipe out the whole shelf, right, real easily. But having it dispersed throughout the inventory would make it hard. They'd have to go around to all the shelves in the pharmacy trying to find the narcotics, right? Which is a little bit scary to me if somebody's robbing you, if they're going to do that. So this is a situation where I don't know how many pharmacies actually do this, but uh, probably most pharmacies keep the controlled substances locked up in a cabinet, or at least the Schedule IIs. But you got to be careful about what you see in practice, which is probably the better practice, but it's not required by the rules or by the laws. So don't let them trick you on that on the MPJE. That yes, legally you could disperse it throughout the regular inventory, even the Schedule IIs. Okay. All right. And that's one of the study tips there as well on page 55. All right, theft or significant loss. This is one of the mandatory reporting requirements to DEA. And there's another form number here. So when you have a theft or significant loss of controlled substances, you must report that to DEA, okay? The notification has to be in writing and within 1 business day. The tricky thing is the form to do this is a DEA 106 form. That's the report of theft or significant loss. But don't let them trick you. You don't have to send the 106 form within 1 business day. Why is that? I mean, you could, but normally when you have a theft or significant loss, there's been some type of diversion going on. And you're gonna have to do an investigation. So when you discover it, what they're telling you is within 1 day of discovery, you gotta notify DEA, look, we discovered there was some diversion going on in our pharmacy. We're doing an investigation. Here's what we know so far. It looks like it involves these drugs, if you know that. And we'll get back to you with the details, and we'll fill out the 106 form when we know exactly what the situation is. That's what you got to do. I would always call them first, but if you read the regulation, it says the notification within 1 business day has to be in writing. So I would do a fax to make it in writing, if people even have fax machines anymore. If you're going to do email, I definitely would get a read receipt to make sure they got the email so I can show that I did it within 1 business day. And then after you do an investigation, then you can fill out the 106 form, because why? The 106 form requires you to list every product that was lost or stolen, right? By NDC number. So, you know, if you had a break-in, it's gonna take you a while to figure that out. But if you had an internal theft, you know, once you discover it, you have to go back to your records to figure out, hey, how long has this been going on? So it's going to take you more than 1 business day to do that. So just realize that, and that's on the top of page 56, talks about the 1 business day is not the actual 106 form. And by the way, the 106 form is filled out online. It's not even a printable form anymore. Florida has a requirement on the bottom of page 55 that you must report a theft or significant loss to the county sheriff of where your pharmacy is within 24 hours. So make sure you do that in Florida. There's no requirement in Florida to report to the Board of Pharmacy a theft or significant loss, but there is to the local sheriff's office. And I should mention, it's a theft or significant loss. So every theft has to be reported, but only significant losses. And I often get the question, well, Dr. Cacciatore, what's significant loss? You got to use your professional judgment. DEA does give you some guidelines here. But, you know, me being a lawyer, the words are important. You know, it says theft or significant loss. So to me, every loss is not significant. But you want to be fairly conservative with this, right? But if you lost, you know, 2 Valium tablets, it fell behind the cabinet, and you looked and you just can't find it, you know, I wouldn't report that, right? If you lost, you know, 2 bottles of 500 hydrocodone products, I probably would report that, right? Even if it's just a loss, right? But any theft, so technically if those 2 tablets were stolen, you would have to report those, okay? So this is me being a lawyer probably. Okay. So miscellaneous DEA laws and rules. DEA has a convicted felon rule. The convicted felon rule just says you can't employ someone in your pharmacy who has access to controlled substances if they've been convicted of a felony related to controlled substances. It just makes kind of common sense. Believe it or not, you can get a waiver or you can request a waiver from DEA if you really want to hire someone who's been, rehabilitated that work in your pharmacy. I have never heard of anyone successfully getting a waiver. I've talked to some pharmacist attorney friends of mine, and nobody I talked to has ever been successful, done that successfully, but there is a mechanism to do that apparently. And the employee screening procedures and employee responsibility report diversion, what is that about? Well, remember, the employees in a pharmacy are not DEA registrants, right? So DEA puts the obligations to report diversion, theft, or loss on the DEA registrant. And these are obligations that they put on the DEA registrant to screen their employees. They got specific questions that they want DEA registrants to ask their employees about their criminal history and use of controlled substances. So make sure when you hire people that are going to have access to controlled substances in your pharmacy, that as part of your hiring process, ask the specific questions that DEA requires you to ask. And the employee responsibility to report diversion, what DEA is saying here is that if you see diversion going on in your pharmacy or you suspect that going on, as an employee of a DEA registrant, you have an obligation to report that to management, right? And then management would have the obligation, or the registrar, the owner, would have an obligation to report that to DEA. You can't simply just ignore it if you see it in a pharmacy. The last kind of miscellaneous rule here is the federal transfer warning. And that's that little language you see on every prescription label when it's dispensed that says, warning or caution. It says federal law prohibits the transfer of this drug to any person other than the patient for whom it was prescribed. That warning is required by DEA on controlled substance prescriptions. And actually, DEA only requires it on Schedule 2 through 4. They don't require it on Schedule 5. Why would they not require it on Schedule 5? Because DEA realized that you can buy some Schedule 5s under federal law without a prescription, exempt narcotics. We'll talk about that a little later. And Florida technically still allows that. It's not really done in Florida from what I hear. Ironically, the Florida law on this transfer warning label says you got to put it on all controlled substance prescriptions, 2 through 5, okay? It says all prescriptions. So I guess if you're doing a non-prescription Schedule 5 drug, you wouldn't have to provide that warning. The only reason it comes up is that little trick on the Schedule 5. It comes up in some states, but they couldn't trick you in Florida because it is required on Schedule 5s in Florida. The other thing is the way pharmacies comply with this law, this regulation, is they put it on every prescription label, even the non-controls, right? But just realize on the MPJE that's only required for controlled substance prescriptions. And in Florida, it's Schedule 2 through 5, so all controlled substance prescriptions. Okay, and that's in your study tip as well. All right. Next is the disposal and destruction of controlled substances. And we're going to talk a little bit here about another DEA form. DEA Form 41 is when you want to destroy drugs. And to destroy drugs on the premises, you'd have to use a DEA Form 41. Most pharmacies don't do that anymore because the problem is you have to have a method to do this that complies with all other laws and regulations, and you can't really, flush it down the toilet or pour it down the sink. Because we don't want controlled substances getting into the water supply. But just realize that is the form you would use if you want to destroy drugs on the premises. And these are drugs that haven't been dispensed yet. They're part of your inventory, okay? Because again, we want to have a record of where the drugs went. So if you destroyed them, you need to have a record of it. Otherwise, we're not going to know where those drugs went. The oddball thing there is Florida law, it's on the bottom page 57, says after you destroy the drugs using DEA Form 41, you have to send a copy of DEA Form 41 to the DEA within 1 business day. that actually conflicts with what DEA says. DEA says you don't have to send a copy of the Form 41 unless DEA requests it. But since you're taking the exam for Florida, my recommendation would be answer it according to what Florida says. So Florida says I need to send a copy to within 1 business day to DEA. That's what I'm going to do. The more common way to and then the more common way to dispose of drugs is on page 58, and that's transfer to a reverse distributor. And this is what most pharmacies do, because they don't want to mess with trying to destroy them on the premises. And if you're sending your controlled substances to a reverse distributor, they're called a reverse distributor because they only take drugs back from places, and they actually do the destruction. Okay, so they would use DEA Form 41 when they do the destruction. But when you send your controlled substances back to a reverse distributor, you don't use DEA Form 41. Why? Because you're not destroying the drugs. The DEA Form 41 is only for when you destroy the drugs. What are you doing in that case? You're simply doing a distribution of expired controlled substances or whatever they are from your pharmacy to another DEA registrant. The other DEA registrant is a reverse distributor. There's actually a separate category of DEA registrant for reverse distributors. So don't be tricked with that. You would use what? You would use an invoice if it's Schedule 3 through 5. And what would you use if it's Schedule 2? A 222 form. But tricky part, who would fill out the 222 form? Who wants the drugs? Who's receiving the drugs? The reverse distributor is. Well, how do they know what they want? How do they know what they want to, quote, order? You have to get on the phone and call them up and say, okay, I've got 10 boxes of morphine, 10 milligrams. I've got, three bottles of whatever the controlled substance is, right? It's got to be Schedule 2. We're talking about the 222 form. So, you got some morphine or some Dilaudid or whatever you're going to send them back, and they'll fill out the 222 form and they'll send a copy to you. So that's how that would work. Okay. On page 58 is disposal of dispensed controlled substances at nursing homes. Nursing homes in Florida, we'll get to this in another video, are called Class 1 institutional pharmacies, which is kind of unusual. Most states don't give a pharmacy permit to the actual nursing home, because in most states, those drugs that are delivered to the nursing home are considered dispensed already. And Florida considers them dispensed too. But Florida takes the position that since those drugs are at the facility and the facility has control of them, they have to have a pharmacy permit. Okay, they don't have to have a pharmacist working there. But anyway, this rule allows those drugs to be destroyed at the nursing home by a consultant pharmacist and some witnesses. Make sure you know who the witnesses can be. Now, would you use a DEA Form 41 to do that? No, and this is the study tip on the bottom of page 58. Why? Because those drugs have already left the inventory of the pharmacy that is servicing that nursing home. So they've been accounted for already. They've been, quote, dispensed, right? A DEA Form 41 is you only use when you're destroying drugs that are part of your stock inventory. They're also used nowadays when you're getting rid of if you're a collector taking things back from patients, but I'm not going to worry about that for this purposes. Okay. Oh, and that's the next thing actually on the top of page 59. For the longest time, there was no legal way for patients or patients' family members to return controlled substances back to a pharmacy to be destroyed. And this created a problem if a family member died and they had lots of narcotics or something, controlled substances, and said, what am I going to do with all these drugs? Many patients wanted to bring them back to the pharmacy, say, can you take these back? There was no legal way. Why? Because those drugs have left the closed system of distribution that we talked about, right? And you can't take them back, and you want to add them into your inventory. You can't take them back and redispense them for sure once they've been dispensed. So there was no legal way to do that. So DEA started hosting these drug take back days where people would come and bring all their controlled substances and even non-controlled substances, which has been a great thing. They started doing that first, and then they finally passed a new rule that said, and it continued to do the drug take back days, and many of you may have participated in some of those. But what they also did when they changed the rule was they said, okay, now we're going to allow, not mandate, pharmacies can serve as authorized collectors of unused drugs that have already been dispensed from ultimate users, basically from patients. So to do this, you have to get your DEA registration modified to indicate that you are an authorized collector. I don't go into the details but there's all kinds of rules about how these collection bins have to work. They got to be secure. They have to have an inner liner that can be sealed, because people are just dumping all kinds of stuff in there, right? You don't even know what's going in there, right? So, but any pharmacy can do this. You don't have to do this, but if you are going to do it, make sure you get your DEA registration modified, because DEA wants to know which locations are authorized collectors to make sure you're doing it correctly. And they also have mail back programs where you can send out these mailable bags that can be sealed and they're tamper evident, where people can mail back their controlled substances to you as well. There's another law that a lot of people know about, I think, because it was passed fairly recently and DEA hasn't passed regulations on it, but I wanted to include it since we're talking about disposal. And that's on page 59. It was part of the Support Act, and the Support Act was a comprehensive opioid bill passed by Congress in 2018. It did a lot of different things. But one of the things that was kind of stuck in there, and I haven't heard a lot of people talk about this yet, was it said it allows an employee of a qualified hospice program to handle controlled substances that were dispensed to a hospice patient for the purposes of destruction. So DEA has not passed any rules on this, but I just wanted to point out that it is the law because it was passed in 2018. And it's probably, I think, helpful that it allows them to take the drugs maybe to an authorized collector or somehow handle those drugs for destruction on behalf of the patients, because the patients may not have any family members or something like that, is what I'm thinking. Okay. All right, we're going to turn now to inventories on page 59. So we've talked a lot about record keeping, right? And you got to track where all these drugs are going, either with an invoice or a 222 form when you're ordering them. If you lose them, you got to have a 106 form. If you destroy them, you got to have a form 41. A lot of this has to do with record keeping, right? But remember, those records are useless if you don't have a starting point, right? And the starting point is your inventory. So you have to take an inventory of all your controlled substances when you first open an initial inventory of a pharmacy, and then every 2 years thereafter. It's a biannual inventory requirement. Biannual meaning every 2 years. Florida also requires a biannual inventory. Some pharmacies keep what's called a perpetual inventory. You know, with the computer systems, it's probably not that hard to do these days, right? A perpetual inventory is a continuous inventory. So at any point in time, you know, a pharmacy or a hospital might be able to say, yeah, this is how much of this item I have, this is how much of this item I have. And that's fine. But even if you keep a perpetual inventory, at least every 2 years, you're going to have to take a physical inventory and validate that you're reconcile that inventory, make sure it's correct. But there is no requirement to keep a perpetual inventory. So again, sometimes the best practice goes beyond what's required in the law. Only every 2 years, okay? And remember, this is an inventory of your controlled substances. There's no requirement to take an inventory of your non-controlled substances, but many businesses want to do it for business purposes, right? Many pharmacies do it. So sometimes pharmacies will do their controlled substance inventory. At the same time, they'll do an inventory of their non-controlled substances. But just realize that's not legally required. And DEA says that the day you take it's got to be within 6 months. It can't vary for more than 6 months of the time you took the last one. So they give you a lot of flexibility. You know, it doesn't have to be the exact same day every 2 years, but it does have to be within 6 months. If a drug was not scheduled and suddenly became scheduled, you would have to do an inventory of that drug. on the day it became scheduled. You got to keep your eyes and ears open for when a new drug becomes scheduled. And even something got rescheduled, when the hydrocodone combination products got rescheduled from Schedule 3 to Schedule 2, DEA said you needed to take an inventory of them on that day. There are rules about when you take these inventories, how you do the counts. If it's a Schedule 2 product, you have to make an exact count of how many you have. Surprisingly, for Schedule 3 through 5, they say, you know what, as long as the container doesn't hold more than 1,000 tablets or capsules, you can just make an estimate. I've had people say, really? I can look at a bottle of 1,000 that's open and just say, okay, there's 472 in there. That's what the rule says. Okay. Now, you know, a lot of people, when they take their inventories, well, go ahead and count these things out. But I'm just telling you what the regulation says, right? It also helps me when I'm trying to determine what's significant, because I've had DEA investigators tell me, oh, you lost 10 tablets of a Schedule 4 drug. That's significant. You need to report that. And I'm like, really? That's significant? Because your own rules say if it's less than a bottle of 1,000, I could just make a guess of how many I have. They don't like it when I say things like that, but I've done it before. Okay. So again, back to the records. You have your inventory, and now we keep track of everything that you receive and everything that leaves your pharmacy. If the records don't match up, DEA is going to consider that you've had a diversion to controlled substances. That's why all this record keeping is important. How long do you have to keep your records on your controlled substance records? Most controlled substance records, like invoices and 222 Schedule 3, the copy 3 of the 222 form, have to be kept for 2 years. And Florida Controlled Substance Act also follows that 2-year law, but you got to be careful because certain records are subject to other laws, like in the Pharmacy Act. Like in Florida, all prescription records have to be kept for 4 years after the date it was last filled, not even 4 years since it was filled or written, but 4 years after the date it was last filled. So that's for all prescriptions, so it applies to controlled substance prescriptions. So the actual controlled substance prescription records under Florida law would have to be kept longer, 4 years from the date of the last fill. But invoices and other DEA type records have to be kept for 2 years. Now, I will tell you, in real life, most pharmacies probably keep records longer than that, because there are other laws and rules that require longer record keeping requirements. Things like Medicare and Medicaid have some 10-year record keeping requirements. HIPAA has like some 7-year record keeping requirements for privacy things. And so there might be other reasons you keep records longer, but for exam purposes, most controlled substance records have to be kept for 2 years, with the exception being those actual prescriptions. Okay. The records themselves, what DEA says is that records have to be of controlled substances have to be kept separate and readily retrievable. So the way you do that is you have to remember that a lot of these rules around record keeping were written before we had computers, right? So it's not as big a deal today as it used to be, because you can print out your computer records of where the drugs went and things like that. But in the old days, before there were computers, the record of drugs leaving your pharmacy, the main record, was the actual hard copy of the prescription. Because in the old days, what we did in pharmacies was we wrote on the face of the prescription the quantity we filled and the date and the pharmacist's initials. And believe it or not, for every refill, you would record that on the back of the hard copy of the prescription. Okay, and so if DEA was going to do an investigation of a prescriber, let's say, or a patient, as they think is pharmacy shopping or doctor shopping, they want to get to be able to see those records, so they want them to be readily retrievable. So what they said was, your records of disbursement of your controlled substances, dispensing your controlled substances, have to be filed separately, the hard copy files. And again, nobody hardly will ever look at the hard copy files unless they're looking for a fraudulent one or something. They're just going to get the stuff out of the computer. But that's why we have these rules on the bottom of page 60 and over page 61 about how you store your hard copy prescriptions. And what DEA said was, okay, the controlled substance prescriptions have to be separate. So the easiest way to separate them is have one file for Schedule 2, one file for Schedule 3 through 5, and one file for your non-controlled substances. That's what's called a 3-file system. But the rule's written in kind of a convoluted way. It says, well, you can even do a 2-file system where you have Schedule 2 by themselves, and you can stick the 3 through 5s in with the non-controlled substances. But if you do that, we're going to ask you to stamp the 3 through 5s with a big red letter C in the corner. Why would they do that? Because when they want to look through them, that makes them, quote, readily retrievable, because they can just flip through that file and look for that red letter C and say, oh, let me pull that one out. Let me pull that one out. Again, this is before they had computers. The third filing system is you keep all your controlled substances separate, 2 through 5s, but you again stamp the 3, 4s, and 5s with that red letter C to separate them from the Schedule 2s. And then all your non-controls in a third file. I don't think anybody ever used this third option, but it was an option that was out there. And they finally did say, okay, if you have this thing called a computer, you still have to have separate files, but you don't have to stamp them with a red C anymore. So you have to be an old guy like me to actually have had a red C stamp and use it in a pharmacy. Back when I did my internship, I actually did that. So tells you how old I am. Okay, on the bottom of page 61 is central record keeping. This comes up because if you've got multiple pharmacies, you might want to keep some of your records in a central location. And I think what you need to memorize here is what cannot be kept at a central location. Because DEA says, okay, remember, each pharmacy is a separate registrant, so they each should have their own records. And what you can't keep at a central location is an executed DEA order form, an executed 222 form. The executed forms are ones that have been used, right? Well, if one's been used, which copy do you have? You only have copy 3, right? Why couldn't you keep that at a central location? Because, remember what I told you, that is the official record of what came into the pharmacy. And that's got to be kept at the pharmacy, all right? That's copy 3. Your actual prescriptions, the hard copy prescription files and those filing system that we just talked about, those have to be kept on location, right? And then the inventory, because that inventory is specific to that particular pharmacy. So those 3 things cannot be kept at the central location. What does that tell you? If it's an unused 222 forms, you can keep that at a central location. So if you have a group of pharmacies, you know, some chain pharmacies do this. They may have one person who orders Schedule 2s for all the individual stores. They can keep the unused ones, but as soon as they order it, they better send copy 3 to the store, because they have to have that in hand to record what comes into the pharmacy the next day. Right? And what else would that person have to have in order to be the person who orders Schedule 2s from all these different pharmacies? Good trick question. Not trick question. It's a good competency question. They'd have to have a power of attorney, right? From each registrant to order to sign the 222 forms from each pharmacy. I'm not sure if anybody does that in a central system, but they could. Okay. So we are going to stop here and in video 2, and we will pick up with the second half of the controlled substance chapter on page 62, starting in video 3. Thanks, and we'll see you soon.